Okay, well, we've talked about annotated bibliographies, and now I'd like to talk about writing a research paper. You aren't going to be writing a research paper for this particular class, but one of the things that I wanted to cover here is the process that's involved in writing a research paper, because you're undoubtedly writing these in your other classes, and that connection to research and working on your annotated bibliography is pretty strong. Let me give credit where credit is due. This material was adapted from two different books. One is the Student's Book of College English by Squire and Chitwood, and the other is The Craft of Research by Booth, Cullum, and Williams. Both of these are super handy books. I don't know if the Student's Book of College English has been republished a bazillion times since I bought it in 1981. Certainly The Craft of Research keeps coming out, I think, in different editions, and I would recommend either one of them for an undergraduate student. Okay, so what are the purposes of a research paper? And here I might sound a little bit corny, but I got to do it. First of all, writing a research paper teaches you how to handle substantially longer pieces of writing than does the normal classroom theme, okay? Um, the one thing I want you to really take away from this entire lecture is that writing a research paper is not an exercise of simply jumping through a hoop. So many students feel that that's what it is. They come in, they look at the syllabus, they think, oh, I have to write a paper, I write a paper. They never, ever look at writing a paper as something that could be satisfying, but it can be. At a bare minimum, the research paper that you write as an undergraduate will be 5 or 6 type pages. Most papers will probably be 2 or 3 times as long, particularly if you're in a 300 or a 400 level course, if you're an upperclassman. Writing a research paper also teaches you, indirectly, how to use the library and other database resources. In theory, you have learned that in this class, but I mean in theory. And you've done a little bit of homework digging around JSTOR and other databases, but there's nothing like actually writing a research paper, actually doing the research to help you become comfortable and facile with those sorts of resources. And a research paper makes you an expert on your subject. The satisfactions, seriously, are deep and lasting. I admit, when I was a student, particularly when I was a freshman, I didn't really see research necessarily in this light. I think I was jaded from high school. In high school, I felt like I was treading over well-trodden ground all the time. I would be in my biology class, I would be doing an experiment, but in the back of my head, I would think, why am I even doing this experiment? I know if I turn the page in my textbook that the result of the experiment will be there. I'm not doing anything that somebody has never done before. So it just didn't have much of a zing for me. I wasn't becoming an expert on a subject. When you become an undergraduate, you get to transition from that kind of unexciting world to a world that can be very exciting. You can pick a subject that intrigues you. You can pick a subject about which few of your classmates know very much. You're probably not going to be breaking totally new ground across the entire globe, but you may be breaking new ground certainly among your peers and maybe even for your professor. It's not too unusual for me to read a paper on a topic that I don't really know too much about, and the student teaches me something in the course of writing that paper. I find that really exciting, and that's what I mean by the satisfaction being deep and lasting. The research paper prepares you for success in your other courses. It's sort of cumulative. If you learn to write a research paper well in one class, and then it will improve your papers for other classes. It's also my hope that by taking this course, you'll be really well prepared to walk into your next research paper and blow the socks off your professor by providing a fantastic set of resources and citations that really speaks to your scholarly chops. Okay, so where do you even start? Let me talk a little bit about the basic steps in writing, how to approach an assignment. First of all, the best way to approach an assignment is not to suddenly look at it the night before it's due. That tends to be many students' approach, and no good research paper can be done in that short a period of time for all kinds of reasons, okay? So the first piece of advice I have is that when you get an assignment, start thinking about it early on. It doesn't mean you have to be in the library every night right at the beginning of the semester, but start thinking about what you might like to write about, which brings me to my next point. Unless your professor has given you a prompt and you have to choose one, you get to choose a subject. Sometimes I provide my students with suggested prompts in case they can't think of anything they're excited about, but I usually leave their choices wide open because there's nothing worse than reading a paper on a topic that the writer really doesn't like or doesn't care about. So when you choose your subject, think about what you're interested in. And also think about something that you can handle in the scope of the assignment. Here at the University of Albany, our collection of Japanese language materials and Japanese studies materials is relatively small. And so often a student will come to me and say, I want to do a paper on this particular topic, and I think it's a great topic, but I also know that it's going to be very hard for the student to pull together all the resources that he or she needs. Or the student is really excited about a topic, but I happen to know that there just isn't that much available in English on that topic. Maybe there's a ton of stuff in Japanese, but the student is only in, say, second year Japanese and can't really manage to wade through all that material. And so I'll advise the student maybe you should tweak your topic a little bit so that it's a doable project. Not that it's a bad topic, but that it's a doable topic. So once you get this idea, you should do some preliminary reading to refine your subject. There's a professor, a colleague of mine here at University at Albany, who often quotes his advisor from graduate school saying, no topic is too small. And it's a funny thing, but it also in a way is true. I often assign relatively small papers between 5 and 10 pages, and my students will come to me during office hours and suggest a topic that I know really deserves 50 pages. And so we work hard to whittle it down into something that's more manageable. So what you should be doing is some preliminary reading to narrow your topics from something really broad, say the history of the Tokugawa, to something really, really much finer that you can do some serious research on. The next step is one that students have a really tremendously hard time with. And we work on it and we work on it. There's actually a process. I'm going to try and break it down for you. And this is again based on that book, The Craft of Research. I really encourage you to read through that entire chapter. I put a PDF of it up on Blackboard. I'm going to summarize it here. It won't hurt you to go through the material twice. If you can do this, the rest of it should be easy. So you need to form a thesis. I don't know if you've ever submitted a paper to a professor and the professor will come back and say, yeah, but there's no thesis. What's your thesis? This happens on our campus quite often. So how do you form a thesis? And I want to emphasize that a thesis is not a topic, okay? So I said on the previous slide that you should do some preliminary reading to refine your subject. You choose something you're interested in. So now you've got something you're interested in. You got to move from an interest to a topic within that interest. A research topic is an interest stated specifically enough for you to imagine becoming a local expert on it. Okay? So that's your topic, but you're still not done yet. That's the first step. Okay, lots of students are good at choosing a topic. It's the next couple steps that make things hard for them. You need to go from, first of all, a broad topic to a focused one. And I'm going to use an example. I was just mentioning the Tokugawa period. I'll use an example from Japanese studies. So let's say initially my interest was the Tokugawa period, and then I decide, my topic is going to be the politics of the Tokugawa period. Well, that's still a pretty big area. I mean, the Tokugawa was over 250 years long. So now I have to refine that to a focused topic. How about the alternate attendance system and the efficacy of the alternate attendance system? If you don't know what that is, you might want to pause the video, just do a quick Google search. I think there's a Wikipedia page on it and you can read up on it, okay? I won't stop right now to do that. So once I've got that narrowed down, I need to move on to the next step. I have to go from that focus topic to the question, and a thesis ultimately involves a question. So how about this? Was the end of the alternate attendance system directly responsible for the fall of the Tokugawa? Something I've been wondering about. Okay, the thesis, we're still not finished yet. We're still not at the refined thesis point, but we're getting there. So I have my topic, I get it focused, and it raises a question in my mind. I've read a little bit about the alternate attendance system. How did that really fit into the picture of the Tokugawa and Tokugawa politics? Okay, what's the next step? The next step is to go from that question to its significance. I like to think of this as the so what moment. So lots of students pose questions, they're curious about things, but they need to take it that final step and they need to make a statement, an argument, something that they're trying to convince their reader of. So, for example, if the alternate attendance system was the linchpin of the Tokugawa, the decision to revoke it was a mistake. If the demise of the system was incidental to the fall of the Tokugawa, then its revocation was simply a move toward modernization. So I've got two possibilities there. One of those will be my thesis. Maybe I'm going to argue that revoking the alternate attendance system was a mistake. Or maybe I'm going to argue that, well, it was really just a move toward modernization and it got lost in the shuffle of all of that. Okay. But this is something then in my paper I'm going to argue. So I've made this bold statement. I've made my reader sit up and take notice. And now I need to lead my reader through the thought process with proper citations so that my reader can come to the same conclusion that I did. So that's really what you need to do with a thesis. You got to get to a point where you argue in your paper the answer to the question, so what? And I've removed the names to protect the guilty, but on this slide and the next slide, I have provided you with real life bad introductory paragraphs that have been submitted to me by undergraduates here at the University of Albany. This first one was from my, my class on modern literature. This is the very first paragraph of the paper. Natsume Soseki, the author of Kokoro, wrote a straightforward novel with few characters. The novel contains complex allusions, with almost every character becoming a metaphor. In this novel, Soseki's characters seem designed to encourage a reader to be more introspective. Readers are left to decide for themselves whether the characters generate feelings of admiration or feelings of disgrace. Perhaps in this novel one might learn from others' experiences, and by doing so may appreciate the novel. The reader may appreciate the message while at the same time be disturbed by the contents of the story. Kokoro is yet another demonstration of Soseki's concern with man's loneliness in the modern world. While he addresses this issue in other stories, it is in one of his other novels that the protagonist cries out, "How can I escape except through faith, madness, or death?" It is uniquely portrayed here in Kokoro. To which all I can say is, huh? A thesis? Argument? What's the... I don't even know what to do with that paragraph. That was just somebody thinking out loud. Maybe you could find a little argument in there somewhere, but it's lost in the morass of meandering prose. We'll look at another one. This is from my class in World War II literature. World War II was a tumultuous time for all those who were involved. Some people were all for the war, wearing their pride on their sleeves. They showed their patriotism in several ways, though in many cases the best way that they felt that they could show that they loved their country was to serve in its military, willing to die for their homeland. Some people wanted their country to be victor in the war, but were not willing to give up their very lives for it. However, many had not much choice in the matter. In any case, everyone, whether they liked it or not, was entwined in the war and everything it entailed. Okay. Thesis? Something you could prove in 5 or 10 pages? This was actually a 10-page paper. There's nothing there. Don't do that. If you suffer from writer's block and you end up writing stuff like this as your first paragraph, be brave. Go back when you're done writing your paper and delete it. And write an introductory paragraph that actually reflects the content of your paper. This, by the way, and the previous slide, neither one of them reflected the content of the paper as you went forward. I'll spare you the pain of reading, but you can trust me on that one. Everybody suffers from writer's block. Oh, I got to do this introductory paragraph. I have to sort of get over this hurdle. You think to yourself, fine, write it, but know that you're probably going to have to revise it. You may have to just delete the whole thing and start all over again once your paper is finished, so that you have an introductory paragraph that lays out where that paper goes. I don't have a separate slide for this, but I strongly encourage students to write an outline of their paper before they get started. I know outlines are so passé these days, but really, an outline, a good outline is your roadmap, and it helps you stay on target. When I was working on my dissertation, which is admittedly a much bigger project than typical undergraduate paper, but when I was working on my my graduate dissertation, I had an outline a few pages long, and I taped it to the wall in front of my desk so that while I was sitting there working and typing and reading, I could always go back to it. And so if I was thinking about a new interesting twist to my thesis that I wanted to add, I would pause and look up at my outline and say to myself, okay, it doesn't fit here, but it does fit there, so that everything stayed organized and it didn't meander around as an argument. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the basic steps in writing. You should compile a working bibliography in addition to having that outline that I just mentioned. As you read through materials, keep track of materials that you think are going to be particularly useful, and this is where Zotero can really come in handy. That's not the same as your final bibliography, and you can annotate this, particularly if you're using Zotero. You can annotate this for your own purposes. When I was working on my dissertation, I didn't have the advantage of all the software that you have today. And so I used the method that I was familiar with all the way back to high school, and that is keeping my working bibliography on 3x5 note cards. So every work was on a 3x5 card with some annotations of my own. And I kept that in a small file box. I still have that file box in my office for nostalgia's sake. But it was a really important resource for me. And as you're going through these materials, take notes. Be careful to provide enough information so that you can cite your sources. Most of us, including myself in the academy, have that story about some great idea or great resource, and then we lost the site to it. I had one of those in my dissertation. It was a really cool idea. And when I sat down to integrate it into the text, I realized that I hadn't properly noted down where I'd found it. I just kind of had it in the back of my head, and then when I went to try and find it again, I couldn't. And you know, if you can't cite it, you can't use it. So I had to leave it out of my dissertation, and it was a real disappointment. So be careful to provide enough information, whether you're using note cards or using Zotero, so that you can find what you want to cite. Okay, so I already mentioned this. You should make an outline of your paper as a beginning step. And then you should write a first draft of your paper and let it sit around for a day or two. Don't write the first draft and then immediately try and fix it. A lot can happen in a day or two. You can come back, you can read it with fresh eyes. I know a lot of undergraduates put things off to the last minute, and so they don't really have this time to do a first draft and a second draft, but I try and encourage my students to do that by giving them first draft and second draft opportunities, and so that I can give them feedback between the two. Even if your professor doesn't give you that opportunity, I would strongly recommend that you give it to yourself. So when you write that first draft, maybe you feel like you can't look at it with fresh eyes. Have a friend read it, and have your friend tell you whether it makes sense or not, okay? Third, don't plagiarize. There's a link that you were expected to follow early on in the semester about plagiarism, the tutorial on the UAlbany Library website with lots of details about that. I cannot emphasize this enough. There's no reason to plagiarize. Plagiarizing is just being lazy. Moreover, plagiarizing students have entirely shown that they never understood the importance and the significance and the purpose of the research paper. They are viewing it, as I mentioned earlier, simply as jumping through a hoop. But it shouldn't be. This is part of your growth as a student, and copying material from somebody else is not going to help you grow. Moreover, depending on your professor, it may significantly hurt your grade. It could tank your academic career if you're not careful. Why do that? The whole point of being in college is to grow as a person, and this is not going to help. All right, so once you've written that first draft and you've set it aside for a couple days, review your draft. Edit it as you see necessary. And sometimes it's helpful, as I said, to have a friend read it. It doesn't have to be somebody who's in the class. It could be anybody. And have that person provide comments. How robust is your argument? And finally, before you turn in a final draft, you should definitely proofread for grammatical and spelling errors. I addressed this when we were working on word processing, but I'll repeat it. It's so easy in Microsoft Word and just about any word processing software to do grammatical and spelling checks. It's an insult to your reader to turn in something that hasn't been gone over at least once by one of those checkers. So take the extra 10 seconds or 20 or 30 seconds that it may require and do proofread your paper. Okay, so we talked about that process. Now I want to really talk about some basic writing pointers. And these are common tendencies that we see students have when they're writing their papers. Just reading through these slides is not going to solve the problem necessarily, but it may help you understand what to look for when you're in that review process after you've written your first draft and you're working toward the second one. First of all, your paper should be as concrete as you can make it. Here's an example of something that is abstract. The telephone is a great scientific achievement, but it can also be a great inconvenience. Who could begin to count the number of times that phone calls have come from unwelcome people or on unwelcome occasions? Telephones make me nervous. All right, it's not too bad as English composition is concerned, except that it's pretty vague, it's pretty abstract. We're not really sure what's bugging the author beyond the amorphous concept of telephones. Here's an example how we could take that statement and make it more concrete. The telephone is a great scientific achievement, but it can also be a great pain. I get calls from bill collectors, hurt relatives, salespeople, charities, and angry neighbors. The calls always seem to come at the worst times, too. They've interrupted my meals, my baths, my parties, my sleep. I couldn't get along without telephones, but sometimes they make me a nervous wreck. So in this second paragraph, we get specifics, not just unwelcome occasions, but meals, baths, parties, sleep, and all that kind of thing. Being concrete makes it easier for you to convince your reader of your point. You should be economical with your language. Sometimes students think I have to write 1,500 words or I have to write 3,000 words, and so their eye is constantly drifting toward that word count in WordPerfect or Microsoft Word. And they've also kind of been conditioned to think that if they use big and fancy words all the time, then it sounds more intelligent. But I would argue that economy brings your point home because it does so very quickly. Here's some examples of verbosity. His hair was red in color. Pollution conditions that exist in our cities are disgraceful. The building has a height of 934 feet. She was in a depressed state of mind. At this point in time, these are things that I think we can all imagine ourselves saying, or we've said something like it in our lives. More often than not, it happens when we're speaking because we're trying to formulate our thoughts while the words are coming out. We're trying to buy time, and so we end up being more verbose. But when you're writing, that shouldn't happen. Here's some examples of what you can do with these example sentences to make them more economical. Instead of his hair was red in color, how about his hair was red? Red in color is redundant. Pollution in our cities is disgraceful, as opposed to that exists in our cities. Of course, pollution that doesn't exist in our cities with the contrast object, it doesn't make sense. The building rises 934 feet. She was depressed. And my favorite, now. At this point in time, at this juncture, I hear it all the time. Why not just say now? Few other stylistic concerns I'd like to cover. Passive verbs, you should avoid them. I'll show you some examples. Repetition, it can be good and it can be bad. Slang, really a no-no for academic papers. And big words, words that are bigger than they need to be. All right, let's start with passive verbs. Sometimes you can't avoid a passive verb, but you should avoid them if it sounds good. This poem is liked by John is unnecessarily passive. The movie was seen by the critic is unnecessarily passive. The bill is going to be voted for by the senator, again unnecessarily passive. How could we fix these? John likes this poem. The critic saw the movie. The senator is going to vote for the bill. These are all in active voice. When you're in Japanese studies, and if you're reading a lot of Japanese texts, passive verbs and passive voice is something that you can easily slip into because passive voice is used so often in Japanese, and it's not considered in the Japanese context as a stylistic problem. So when you're thinking in Japanese and then you end up writing in English, once in a while these things easily slip through, and I'm speaking from experience. Try to avoid them, however, when you're writing in English. So what's good and bad repetition? Repetition for clarity can be good. For example, five drug companies have been accused of misleading advertising. The first of these companies is, and then one would go on to iterate. Repetition can also be good for impact. The decision must be made this week, not this year, not this month, not early next week, but this week. I often use this sort of impact repetition when I'm telling students not to plagiarize. But repetition can be bad when it's redundant. For example, in today's modern contemporary world, there's way too much going on there. Modern and contemporary are synonyms here. Why have them? Repetition of the same word is often bad. I really enjoyed reading this story. It was a really exciting story with real people and real situations. The suspense was really terrific. There are too many real and reallys in that statement. Often that kind of repetition is because the writer doesn't have a good grasp of the range of the English lexicon. One of the things I love about English, although it has its maddening aspects, is that it has the largest lexicon of any language in the world. And so you can almost always find the perfect word for it, for whatever the thing is that you want to express. Sometimes it might be a simple word like really, or nice, or interesting, but you should make an effort to find a more specific word for whatever you need. Some students make the mistake of writing their papers much like I think they write tweets or their emails. How about something like this? This profound political allegory really turned me on. That's not very good. How about this profound political allegory really appealed to me? In Hamlet, Hamlet's girlfriend Ophelia goes nuts. How about if she goes insane? Don't use abbreviations like BTW or LOL. That's appropriate when you're emailing a friend, but it's not appropriate in an academic paper. And most certainly, do not use emoticons. Emoticons are fun. I use them myself once in a while when I'm writing to a friend on email because they can convey an emotion and prevent a misunderstanding. But when you're writing an academic paper, your language should be doing that. What about big words? Unnecessarily big words. For example, many of our new buildings suffer from inadequate fenestration. That may be a word you don't even know. Some of the water we drink is insalubrious. They raise their hands in the time-honored gesture of respect to the emblem of their nation's sovereignty. All right, that first one. Many of our new buildings have too few windows. That's what fenestration is. Some of the water we drink is unhealthy. They saluted their country's flag. So you see what I mean by unnecessarily big words on the left, when you can be more precise and more succinct. There are also a number of grammar concerns. Adjectives versus adverbs. Apostrophes, the proper use of apostrophes. Comparisons. And one of my pet peeves, fragmentary sentences. Let's look at some examples. Here are 10 sentences in which you are given a choice of an adjective versus an adverb. What I'd like you to do is pause the video and take a look, read through all 10 sentences, and then start the video again, and I'll give you what the answers are. Okay, here are the answers. How did you do? Notice that adverbs are used to describe how an action is being done, and an adjective is used to describe a noun. It's one of those things we learned probably in first grade, but a lot of people over the years get sloppy. They hear other people using words incorrectly, and they end up using the wrong choice. Another grammatical problem is the use of apostrophes. And for reasons I'm really unclear about, I see more mistakes with apostrophes now in 2013 by far than I did when I first came to the University of Albany in 1994. Over time, the proper use of apostrophes has become clearly a very troubling, difficult area for a lot of students. So here I have 4 sentences, and the words in red are words that might need apostrophes, but might not. Keep in mind that an apostrophe is used to either indicate a contraction or it's used to indicate possession. It is never, ever, ever used to indicate plural. I cannot emphasize that enough. So once again, what I'd like you to do is to pause the video, take a look at these sentences, think about which words need their apostrophes, and then start the video again, and I'll show you the answers. All right, here are the answers. How'd you do? I hope it wasn't too difficult for you. Most of my students, when they're really put to the test, know what to do with their apostrophes, but I'll tell you, in the real world, I see all kinds of mistakes. Next, I'd like to look at comparisons. How about this sentence? Alka-Seltzer commercials are more entertaining than Anacin. That's comparing commercials with a medicine. How about Alka-Seltzer commercials are more entertaining than Anacin commercials? That would make more sense. Her marks were higher than anyone in the class. That compares her marks with human beings. How about her marks were higher than anybody else's marks in the class? His great big sad eyes are like a cocker spaniel. This compares his eyes with a dog. It should say his great big sad eyes are like the eyes of a cocker spaniel. Her qualifications were as good as John. This compares her qualifications with a human being. It should say John's qualifications. I get along with my in-laws better than my wife. As many of my students often point out, this sentence could be interpreted in 2 different ways. We're not really sure the proper way. My mother's temper is harder to deal with than my father. This compares somebody's mother's temper with a human being. It should be comparing temper with temper or human being with human being. And next I'd like to look at fragmentary sentences. This is the last of my grammatical pet peeves. Whenever I go to the lake. These are sentences I've actually seen in print. Because first impressions are often wrong impressions. You know where I see these? I see them in newspapers. This is journalistic writing. There's a local writer here in Albany who tends to write his columns in this way, and it just makes me crazy. Here's another example. After she had gathered her information and written her paper. What? What happened? What happened after that? I want more information. The managing editor, an excellent journalist and former reporter, did what? A verb would be really good here. I'd love a verb. Being the most popular actor of his generation. Yes? What about that? Which he had lost several times before. Okay, but incomplete sentence. And clearing away all of the wreckage, helping victims of the storm, and still finding time to operate the communications network. I think what happens with fragmentary sentences is one of two things. Either the person is writing journalistic English and is trying to punctuate something that they have written in a previous sentence, or they started writing a sentence and then kind of got distracted. Maybe the telephone rang, maybe they went to go get a cup of coffee, maybe their thoughts drifted, and by the time they get to the end, they don't realize that they've left it incomplete. And I'm not trying to say that only undergraduate students have this problem, or only high school students have these sorts of problems. All of us have these problems. This is why you should proofread your writing. We're all susceptible to making these mistakes, but there's an easy way to safeguard against them. So that's my advice about writing a research paper. I hope I've inspired you to think about becoming an expert in the field, in the subject that you're interested in, and to see research as a fun challenge, something that will give you lasting satisfaction as a student.